Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. All right, we're doing another current event kind of based episode. The myth is DC Takeover. Now, some people might see this and say that, we're kind of losing it at this point because DC has been taken over. And we don't necessarily disagree with that technically, but that framing, as will be pointed out later in the episode, makes it seem as if there was an administration that was going one way with their policies on crime and such, and then Trump and the Republican Party and his administration swoops in with the troops and imposes fascism on DC, almost absent of whatever was happening prior to it. But as we say in Black Alliance for Peace, this is an escalation of what was already occurring, as opposed to a takeover necessarily in the sense that folks may be understanding it. So, admittedly, are being a bit provocative with this one, but I do think try not to normally do that. But in this sense, I do think it's necessary because it forces us to deal with the framework of how we understand these issues. Um, so, with that being said, I have two guests that are gonna be on. Erica Caines, who many of you already know, with Black Alliance for Peace and Hood Communists, and Oliver Robinson with Pan African Community Action. He is based in D.C. And as is the organization, and Erica is based in Baltimore. So they have been, on the ground there doing work. Dealing with with the rise of repression, but also have been there to see the rise of repression in D.C. from a Democratic administration prior to the federal troops coming in, and the way that it's already really just bolstering the existing police force. So I don't want to keep talking too much because I want this is to be for my guests to speak on this much more eloquently than I can. So we're gonna get into it. We have a decent slate of episodes coming up, so we got another one that will come out a week after this one. But this one we wanted to get out since it's current and the things on the ground are changing. And we have one coming out about black capitalism and sovereignty and looking at tariffs. We have a series coming out in the Klan, and three waves of it. So be on the lookout for those episodes. But anyway, we're gonna get into it. Shout out to our patrons and everybody that continues to support us, and appreciate it. All right, all right. I'm here for one of our more current event-based episodes. So I'm here with Erica Caines, who many of y'all have seen on our show several times, and also Oliver Robinson. So I'm gonna ask you both to introduce yourself, your organization, and yeah, just thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Erica Caines. I am National Co-Coordinator for the Black Alliance of Peace. I am also a co-editor of Hood Communist, and I organize currently in the DMV and Baltimore area specifically.
Peace, peace. Thanks for having me. Oliver Robinson. I'm a organizer with Pan African Community Action, which is based in Southeast DC, organizing for community power in Southeast DC.
Thank you, thank you. Erica, this is a quick aside. You said the DMV in Baltimore area. For people who don't know, can you just clarify that Baltimore is not the DMV?
I mean, if I did, Baltimore would. There's Baltimore, and then there's the DMV, which is what like parts of Maryland, not even all of Maryland, parts of Maryland, DC, and Northern Virginia.
Yeah, because I think people just throw all that together. So just a little bit of geography. But
Yeah.
I guess we get into this because I think most people have seen the news in terms of Trump federalizing the police and bringing in DC and bringing in the troops and National Guard and there people are now saying fascism is here, and we'll get to maybe a question of what that even means. But just for the listeners and for the people watching, Can one of you explain briefly what has taken place in DC concerning crime and the National Guard, and just the general kind of vibe of what happened, what happened these last, I guess, few weeks has everybody paying attention in DC?
Yeah, just as you named, Trump, I believe on the 11th, August 11th, because Netanyahu's speech was on Gaza and the annexation was the 7th. So following that, that Monday, Trump announced the deployment of the National Guard into Washington, D.C., framing it as this sort of crackdown on high crime, out of control crime, rampant crime, and like these safety initiatives, quote unquote. So, the Black Alliance for Peace wrote a statement. We named it as a dangerous escalation in the federal government's militarization, or rather, like as Sharice Bertinselli has been naming it more recently, the policification of the military. So this escalation is the federal government's sort of capture or continuation to capture Black African internal colonies and Black African spaces. So this is when I say escalation, I want to name that that word is very specific. So I know that people keep wanting to name Trump and the speculation of Trump more so because this is a heightened situation. But when we use terms like escalation, it suggests that there's something, comes before that. And so, really, I think that's important to know because while this is a serious matter, these conditions in many instances are unprecedented. They are not conditions that have not been seen before in DC, or in some instances have not been relegated by the quote unquote opposition party or Marilyn Bowser more specifically.
And just to add to that, because I think the escalation piece is important. It came out as a 30-day order for federal takeover of the police. We've seen National Guard, as well as other federal forces kind of taking up that policing power. Obviously, it's already being talked about that it's going to go beyond 30 days, right? That this is going to be a continued and more constant police presence in DC. But to the point of escalation, and not to lean in too much yet, but there is and has already been, right, a scaling up of the repression in DC, right? The youth curfews that we saw this summer, limiting when youth could be outside and limiting when they had to, be with an adult in public spaces, right? The launching of different task force. So this has already been a proliferation of targeting youth particularly, but then also, right, Bowser, who is the mayor of DC. DC politics has always been centered around this sort of false sense of safety and adding policing. So, Trump may be coming in with a greater spectacle, right? There's a lot of theater, there's a lot of fanfare, a lot of hysteria perhaps around it being Trump, but Trump is just magnifying what the trend has already been.
So what would y'all say makes it an escalation primarily from, and I guess that also raises the question of what is it an escalation from?
Mhm.
So I guess let's reverse the question. What is it an escalation from? And then what would make this an escalation?
Yeah, I think even naming Meryl Bowser, so I think it's important to know. I know many recognize Mayor Bowser maybe initially from 2020 and the Black Lives Matter, the paint in the streets and all of that. But Mayor Bowser has been a political problem for quite some time. She has I think it was the Neighborhood Engagement Achievement Results Act of 2015. In 2018, alongside the Metro Police, she increased policing in wards 5, 7, 8. More recently, she passed the crime bill, or she supported the initial crime bill, and Oliver could speak to that. And then she backed the Safe and Beautiful Act that Trump was pushing during the spring. So she has consistently always stood beside the MPD, She advocates for more policing. She is an advocate for quote unquote safety. So she weaponizes instances of crime to say that, see, this is a problem and we need to heighten it, heighten more police force. And then also there's a slew of unresolved murders by MPD that she either supports or doesn't give support for finding out or charging. So she has been essentially a problem that folks have organized around here locally. But I do think when we talk about these kind of local politicians, there's a way that they get national recognition. Hi, Brandon Scott. And so then people don't actually understand what's happening there because of this sort of spectacle of national recognition, right? The first black, or, the first black woman, the first black, the youngest black, and the way that they categorize these folks. There's no real interrogation around the policies that they already have supported that are a big impediment to any of the things that we're trying to do as a people. And none of these are these are all anti-human, anti-people policies essentially that are getting pushed under Bowser. But what I think, when you add a Trump, right? Then it becomes, she's then again seen as someone who is a benevolent figure almost, right? Like she's a good person, quote unquote.
Sympathetic.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
right. Because Trump is who Trump is.
And
So I
he's
think
taking the city from a black woman and the kind of narrative. Yeah.
yeah, right. But this is a black woman who has always been and continues to be, with her recent speech, of course, in support of these kind of anti-people policies under the guise of safety. So like weaponizing carjackings, etc., to kind of make the point that DC is completely unsafe, but where these like Oliver was saying, much of this criminalization is of the youth. Much of this criminalization happens in pockets of DC where African Black people, colonized, working class, poor people live, right? So yeah, I'll let Oliver give some more detail.
Yeah, yeah, no, and I guess just to start, I think on the point of Bowser and Trump, right? And I think it's important to think of them more as collaborators in this effort than the federal government taking something over. It's curious to me, even that framing, and at first, right, recently today, Bowser, celebrated, congratulated Trump, right, for cleaning up DC.
We greatly appreciate the surge of officers that enhance what MPD has been able to do in this city. The most significant thing that we are highlighting today is the area of crime that was most troubling for us.
Just weeks ago, it was, I'm concerned, this is alarming, right? Kind of putting out a very different message. And we see how quickly, right, things change, which kind of speaks to the bipartisan nature of it all, right? You're taking over the city from me by doing exactly what I was doing with more police, right? It's like, what exactly has been taken over, right? If all
Right.
you're doing is advancing the same things that I was doing, right? So I think that's part of it too. And then I think to the point of identity, right? And we see this all the time. It's very easy to latch on to Trump as a boogeyman, right? That Trump just went away, this would go away, this would die down, right? But nothing was stopping the trajectory of DC's increased repression and surveillance, right? They launched a juvenile task force. They were increasing their fare evasion, built fare evasion gates so people can't jump over them, right? Pulling people off of buses, right? ICE was already beginning to act and be deployed in DC, right? Targeting people on the basis of citizenship. All these things were happening, right? And DC was advancing in this way. The federal takeover maybe is putting this spotlight on it, but it's important not to pretend that we weren't already going in this direction.
Now, that's a good point. It was funny. I was flirting with the idea of making the myth DC takeover, but I felt like that might be a little too far. But now that you said it, I might change it. But like, but yeah, I think it is interesting that it is being framed as a takeover. It's and even listening to some of the right and the way they talk about DC as if it's embraced this almost abolitionist politics, right? Like that's the way that the right will talk about it. They love to hit on like cash bail, and how that's being reversed, and that 2020 was all was letting all the criminals back out in the streets, and so this is also, I think, a pushback to that, but it's also to raising that point. It's also we have to remember, like, the Democratic Party fought all. I mean, these are kind of caricatures of abolition, but they fought all of these to fund the police and even cash bail. They fought all of that. Like they blamed to fund the police and stuff for part of why the party is in the position that it's in, right? So it's interesting to see people all of a sudden make it seem like it's just a Trump thing when we will live through all this, you know. so so I guess it's also a question of the kind of this isn't written down, but like as organizers, how do you deal with this kind of, I guess, amnesia that people have? Because again, these aren't some of the stuff we were watching on mainstream news and lived through. This isn't stuff that you have to go dig under the crates for. Not all of this information. So like, what's some of this amnesia that people have when they put it on Trump is how do y'all wrestle with that? I'm just curious, and then we can get back to some of what's on paper.
Well, one, I think they're steered in a particular direction to sort of blame it all on Trump, right? So it makes the amnesia easier to, right? Because to your point, all of this, even when we talk about 2020, is 5 years ago.
Yeah.
In the way that information is disseminated and received is a very, like, people don't even talk about what happened last week, right? So
Mm.
I've been emphasizing as of late, like, the importance of, like, this sort of collective historical memory, or just even having that. Because when we have these conversations about Trump per se, there is a way that folks forget at the same time that Black Lives Matter is painted on the street were all of these repressive bills. There were people out on the street fighting to get, body cam footage still. All of that was happening in 2020. In 2020, as that's on the street, the National Guard was out there, beating up protesters. So the idea that this is something that is new, I think, comes from a way that people have kind of normalized or walked in step with these sort of kind of heightened contradictions and heightened repression. Because we do see that the more that this is occurring, the more passive. And I think the role of the Democratic Party has been that to sort of passively, move the people in a direction where they accept some of these things. Because even as I have these conversations about DC now with certain folks, there are folks that are like, well, I mean, they was
Mm.
stealing, you know,
Right,
the
right,
kids
right.
was stealing the cars, like that kind of thing. Even with Baltimore, it's like, well, it's low crime. And so for me, the argument has been like, what are we talking about when we talk about crime? Like, it's such an elusive term that has been weaponized and politicized that it's been wielded, right? So whether it's high or low, it's all kind of creates or validates rather the policing that occurs. It validates the occupation. Because if we go to Baltimore, they're begging Trump to come down there and say, see, look, we got it all under control. Look at all our cops. Look,
Yeah.
got low crime. You don't need
Walk
to
the
be here.
streets with me.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
And then in LA, Karen Bass's big issue, to Oliver's point, is that, LAPD got it. We don't need the federal agents here. We could beat our own people up. We don't need y'all to step in. And that's what we're seeing really play out. If the National Guard is not really doing as much as those videos are showing, it's really the MPD. And so when we talked about earlier about the sort of emboldened, the MPD has been emboldened. When we
Hmm.
were doing the encampments, I did not see half this many cops, half this many. And we seen the way the cops reacted to the students. We didn't even see a blimp of this. And when they were out, they were just standing there. They are overtly aggressive now because the National Guard's there. So I do think when we speak about how we've gotten to these places, I do think there's a way that we kind of have walked into this as well as a people. Like, to one, not like, I want to say, validate, right? To say that, well, agree that crime is bad and something needs to be done about the crime. But then also, the more that we see these more anti-people policies and the more and more repressive our conditions get without any real fight back or organized fight back, people are just accepting this kind of what's going on, right? So when we talk about it, I do think it is important to say, no, remember 2020 when this happened, or even when Jackie Lukman talks about when this happened when she was a child, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not to say that this isn't, again, an escalation or this isn't something that we should be alarmed about, but it is to put it in context of why we should be alarmed about it and who the actual players and enemies that are collaborating, to Oliver's point, are in this, because Trump is not doing it by himself, and he is not doing it without the support of the quote unquote opposition party.
Yeah, and just to pick up on two things there, because two things you said struck out to me that I wanted to add to too. That I think in terms of like combating how people are seeing this and like the connections people aren't making is in, right, 2020 happened, 2022 happened, now it's happening, and those are all distinct and separate periods, right? I think that there's something very, right, divisive about the way, right, propaganda media plays a role in sort of um creating these separations in people's mind, right, markers of when things were bad, when things were good again. And there's a lot of
Right.
bombardment of sort of that framing too, right? This is a time when things are bad. And that's the message you get again and again. Remember when things were good, right? Not what happened then, just it wasn't that. A lot of the framing is just things were not what they are now. And this is bad. Know that this is a very, bad time for you to, and embrace
And
that
you can
narrative
just launder that throughout
for over
forever.
and over. It's
Yeah.
it's like
Yeah.
rinse, repeat. And I
Yeah.
think the other thing too, it's not unique to DC, but people often, I think, with this moment are trying to identify with DC. Like Trump is taking over the DC government and taking DC from us. Like people are trying to identify, I think there's like the cultural affinity. This is our home, right? That the takeover, people are identifying with the government in the sense that, DC is ours. That you see a lot of, well, we built DC, right? DC's our home, like DC's our culture. And in some ways, right, there's truth that people do have cultures, people do have histories and places, but not associated with the DC government that has put out these containment strategies, right? Policed our people, surveilled our people for generations, right? Right. It's sort of this false identification, I think, with DC as a municipality that people are now associating with all of, this is where I live, where my parents live, right? Trump is infringing on that. So I think trying we have to disentangle those two things, right? That people have ties to where they're from, people have, cultures that they maybe culture that they cling to, but that's distinct from um protecting DC's sort of political autonomy is akin to protecting ourselves, protecting our neighborhoods, protecting the people that we know. And I think we have to separate those for people, because I think often that's conflated and people think opposing Trump is protecting all of these other things, right? Which really, the DC local government, right? They're an enemy of you protecting those things. You want to protect your family, your youth, like having a place to live, all the things that you need, right? Identifying with the DC local government's not going to do any of that, right? That's just another enemy, right, with a different face, a different name. And the other thing too that you mentioned, Erica, that um I wanted to pick up on as well, because I thought it was interesting. Um, I think in some ways, like we're kind of in a moment too where um people have a sense of hopelessness around their conditions, and because they're not dealing necessarily with structural thinking, like they're not thinking about the structures that are causing what people are dealing with, right? The other coin of, because you also have people thinking, well, I mean, Trump's cleaning up the streets, right? I
Right.
mean,
Right.
I
Yeah.
mean that, people, my neighborhoods are, they're getting safer, okay? These people, like, and people are just feeling the outcome, right, of the structural issues that are going unresolved. So I think in some ways you have to address those. You can't tell people, listen, like repression's bad, surveillance bad, and they're like, but what about the chaos in my neighborhood? What about, it doesn't, I don't think people cling very well to that narrative. They don't cling to issues are unaddressed. I'm not seeing solutions. I'm only seeing, right, victimization. I'm only seeing people being traumatized by really, real violence that occurs, right? That
Right.
we can acknowledge that real violence does
Time out.
take
Right.
place. I would take the word crime out of it, right? People are harmed by very real violence at the neighborhood level that affects people. And as organizers, we have to address that. We have to get to the root of that. Because if we try to leave that alone and just say, make it all about the ideology and Trump versus Bowser and leave that out of it, people will become disillusioned because
Right.
those things also have to be addressed.
Right. No, I agree. And even to that point, like it's never, I always say that or make that distinction that when we talk about abuse or harm or all these interpersonal or intercommunal kind of issues, right? That is a separate thing from the crime that is being talked about on a state level, right? Because they're not really concerned about solving or resolving crime. For them, the issue of crime becomes a political tool where they can weaponize crime, right? So crime fits their best interest or their bottom line. So in the interest of Mayor Bowser, who wants to, maintain control and push for statehood so she can continue to maintain control, crime is something that she is very much concerned with in the narrative of safety, right? So that she could be the face of safety in DC. Trump's concern with crime, as you can see, is really, he is nothing to do with resolving crime. So when we use the language or we understand the way that the term is used, or we understand the way that the term is used, we understand that that has nothing to do with how we ourselves actually resolve the intercommunal violence and intercommunal harm, because we are not dealing with crime. We're dealing with these intercommunal issues that actually are impacting us, right? Crime is a whole other particular kind of beast that without any political power, we can't really define. They get to define crime on a whim. So for me, I think we get hung up on that. And so when we discuss these issues about crime, or when we discuss Trump, or when we discuss Bowser or anything, and then it becomes, well, why would we even need that? Because DC's been having a decline in crime. Sure. And we can argue that for when the city council pushed the crime bill or when the savior,
Right.
the
Right.
decline has been declining. That never mattered to them. The crime, quote unquote, does not matter. But I do think to your point, there needs to be a way, even if we discuss things like the self-defense coalitions or things like that, that we actually speak to and attempt to resolve these intercommunal issues that do exist.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways, a lot of places to go with what y'all said. I think just so we can keep the listeners informed, a few things to knock out, and I have a lot of other questions that aren't on paper. But you mentioned statehood, um, and that's something that, I've heard for years. I'm sure y'all hear it more being out there in that area in terms of DC becoming a state because it's not really a state. It's not even really a city in the general sense that maybe other cities in the US are. So that sometimes is brought up as some kind of solution to this issue because then Trump wouldn't be able to take over legally. That's the argument, at least in the same way that like he can take over more easily, at least in DC, than maybe he can in Chicago or whatever. I do want to get back to the crime question or the harm question and even some of the nationalism that this inspires. There's a lot of things y'all said, but just so we can lay out the facts for folks, when people say statehood, what are we talking about? How does that have anything to do with this takeover? Can y'all just kind of lay that out?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess at a general level, right? People say statehood, they're talking about equal representation in the federal process, right? So having representatives, participation in the Senate, right? The ability to have full governance and exercise governance. Obviously, having things like a state budget, right, and receive federal funds that states, different state allocations. So there's a lot of, I think, things that states benefit from in that respect. All of those things in terms of representation, in terms of receiving funding, I think have nothing to do with actually what's on the ground and what people are dealing with. In the sense that um who cares if there's a representative, a state representative for DC or a state senator, if they just vote in more policing and more surveillance like they do in Maryland or California or New York? Like what difference, how do black working class people fare in Baltimore? Maryland is a state. Right, you know what I mean? Like they've got police and cop cities and surveillance in Baltimore too, right? And in Los Angeles. So to me, what is it that we're saying would be materially different on the ground for working class African people in any of the places we're talking about, right? So I think largely statehood to me is it's a political play, right, for those who are seeking either through their own. I mean, there's a lot of the political consulting industry is huge in DC, right? The lobbying industry is huge in DC. There's people who would benefit greatly, right, from greater political access and political power on the legislative and congressional floor if DC was a state.
It's
I don't know.
also it's
Yeah,
also an argument just the Democratic Party makes that they could win elections because that's more electoral votes. But go
right.
ahead. Yeah.
No, 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 no. That's another point too. That
Yeah.
DC would presumably be a blue state, and it would
Mhm.
add probably a consistently blue state. But again, if this is a bipartisan effort, right, to target our people, right? What do when we talk about the base of people that we're representing, we're talking about the people we're trying to organize. We're talking about people at large, right, who are being crushed by the system. It'd be inconsequential to me that DC would become a state. The material impact of poverty, the lack of housing people have, the way people are policed, being a state isn't going to affect those things. So I think it's sometimes that's put out there as a solution. Again, this false identification, right, with DC autonomy, not the autonomy of people, but DC as a political entity, right? Which who controls that, right? The same people that control the federal government, the same power, the same moneyed interest, the same capitalism, right? So what are we really talking about there? So that's how I see it. I think it's largely a misnomer, and when we're talking about statehood and not self-determination, right? We're not talking about power for people. We're conflating it with this idea of statehood.
So similar to how Erica talked about crime and harm, the statehood and self-determination are being like combined together in ways that
Yeah,
don't actually play out in real life. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah. Um, no, I think I agree with that. I always think about I mean, that's the question for Puerto Rico as well, right? And so you always have to like, what would be the benefit of that, or where have we seen the benefit of that? And even to the point of, what Trump can and can't do. I think LA has shown some things. He's calling numerous other states. And cities. So I think they do expose that there is a limitation or whatever limitation that is without any kind of political power to statehood.
Yeah, and I think too, right? Like, and I'm even thinking about ICE and the expansion of ICE and the recent federal budget, kind of what's going to pour billions more into ICE as an agency, into these federal forces in general. Again, it's, and that's not even a Trump thing, right? That will go beyond Trump, right? The expansion of that type of federal power. In the face of that, what does statehood mean, right? If we're making this a question, to harken back to what you're saying, a question of nationalism, a question of settler colonialism, expanding ICE, expanding what that is across the nation, what does statehood mean in the face of that? If that agency is being bolstered, if there's collaboration with on the local level, with these types of federal policing that we're seeing, I think that also kind of puts a contradiction in the statehood argument, right? Because we're seeing these federal agencies kind of have this overarching power, right? That statehood really has nothing to do with.
And DC is a sanctuary city, I believe, right? Or
Uh, I I I think presumably, even though there's been some, I think that might be a little bit in question now. Don't quote me on that, but I mean, the collaboration that we're seeing with, to what you said, MPD and ICE on the same rage working together. I mean, I'm not sure what the sanctuary means anymore in this moment. Um,
Yeah. But yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot to explore. I think I don't know this question of people clinging to something, some kind of like sense of belonging because these cities are seemingly under siege in I guess in a different way to them, right? Like than they were prior. I mean, even being out here in the Midwest and seeing how people are reacting to when Trump said Chicago, and I'm seeing folks like we're not gonna let that go down here. And again, some of that there's contradictions in that. Some of that is people willing to step up and take care of folks, right? And then some of that is this, like you were saying earlier, like we built DC and this is ours, and this sense of ownership over something. I'm curious. We talked about having to separate these things, but how are you all going about teasing out these contradictions where people, I guess, in some ways embrace a kind of a nationalism, like this is the real America. This is Trump's not going to take America from us, kind of, how to,
Mm,
but at the same time, these are people who, in some cases, not all cases, might be willing to get involved in a patrol, or they might be willing to, kick ice out of a neighborhood in some cases, right? So how do you parse through those things like that can be difficult.
mm,
Yeah, I think one, there has been, maybe it's always been the case, but there is such a hyperfixation on local dynamics that people miss those particular connections that make this a national issue. So then it becomes simply a fight for DC, or simply a
Free
fight for Atlanta,
DC.
right? Or
Yeah.
simply a fight for Atlanta against Cop City, or simply, a fight for LA against ICE, and not seeing that the same, like, each city is being used as a testing model for where they can expand this in other cities. So whether it is what happened in LA in terms of ICE, or we're seeing here in DC using crime and safety, whatever that they're weaponizing, we're seeing that these are models that are being replicated throughout the nation, right? So the more that we, because I think it's interesting that we say nationalism, but it is a sort of hyper local kind of nationalism where people only are concerned with organizing their area,
Yeah.
right? Not seeing how all of this um informs other processes and other things that are happening across the country. Like there, well, even at Cop City is a model, right? That started one place, and now we're crossing over 40 of them across the nation. So I think there's a way that we get lost in that we don't take a sort of broader view in how these things connect, and where we need to begin to start to fight back, or even have cross conversations about, if this is happening in LA and this is happening in DC, how
Hmm.
did y'all, what's happening with the process of y'all's coalition work? How could we, model that sort of coalition work? What do we need? Like sharing tactics, sharing strategies. But I think that people have this idea that, it's only happening in this kind of way here, and over here we're only doing this kind of work for this, and not expanding the way that we understand these things happening. I think we've just been at a deficit, really, organizationally, as we continue to sort of dig deeper into this hyper local organizing. Because yes, I do think all politics are local, but these politicians are not. Like, everybody know the DC mayor, and everybody know Baltimore mayor, and everybody know Atlanta mayor, everybody know New York mayor, but nobody can tell you what's actually happening in those cities, right? But the politicians are national. So how do we broaden our local conditions, and start to understand that in a national way, so that we can begin to organize? Because for me, that has been sort of the struggle, that people can only see it in that sort of view, because it affects them here. It doesn't what's happening for them, what's happening in LA, it doesn't affect them, not directly. And then 3 months later it's in DC. So now what do we
Right.
do?
Right.
mm. Yeah, and I guess to think about that, because I do think it's important, and the same, I think, kind of hyper local nationalism exists, pride for each city, right? Which, there's, like you said, there's contradictions in that. Everybody has kind of pride in their city. But I think that you break that to me by sort of expanding the political imagination with people, which is kind of a question of base building. And by that I just mean that, right, for most people, the scope of their political imagination in terms of how do I engage in politics is I've got to vote for the right person. That's most people. Most people, that's where it begins and ends in terms of what politics is as a substantive thing that they can latch onto. But I think that you can go deeper when you instead make politics about how do we organize to get the people in your neighborhood and your community what they need, right? How do you become part of that solution? That's a question of base building. That's a question of building programs. That's a question of building organized responses to the material things that people need, as in, you can become people that are actors in those solutions, right? The types of programs, the types of responses that we need, right? Whether it's violence disruption, whether it's housing, whether it's health, whatever it is, people can become involved in those processes themselves, right? And organizing those things, I think, on the local level, it immediately allows you to make those connections because, oh, you're organizing around a food program or a health program in DC. I see the same is happening in Atlanta because the same, right, ruling class interests that are crushing you and making housing unaffordable are doing the same to us. And we can organize around the same fundamental issue, the same fundamental concern, and we have collective interest there, right? Our collective interest doesn't need to be an identification with, the name of the city we happen to be in. It can be around these things that everybody needs and that we need to organize around. So I think it's recapturing that political thought process. And you made me the national thing you thought it made me think of the international question too, right? We
Mm-hmm.
often think about, right, the ways in which, we need to think of ourselves, particularly like working class African people, as part of this collective global South, right? Part of this broader resistance against not just the domestic militarism, but internationally as well. And I think that you need to draw associations there because that'll also shift people's consciousness. As in, the same way I was reading today, with some Paca comrades, we're sharing an article, right? In the same way that Niger kicked out, right, the French owned uranium company and nationalized the industry, kicked them out of the country, right? Like, we need to be kicking out police in our neighborhoods. Like, you should identify with that, right? That is who, right, you need to identify. That is who has your interest, right? We are more aligned with those interests, with those sort of, anti-European domination initiatives, campaigns against those forces, right? We're part of that collective fight, right? And when you think about that, right, you have communities all around the world. And I think that opens people's eyes to this idea that actually things are not insurmountable. We've actually got them outnumbered when we think about the collective communities that we're really a part of. And I think organizing people to see that, these questions more of as colonial questions, right? More questions of who is in charge, who's holding power, and less about the municipality, less about who's in office, who's being elected, right? Fundamentally, what forces are in power, right? And if people can see that, I think that they can see the connections a lot more easily because then you'll see, oh, it's the same forces in power, right? Whether we're talking internationally, nationally, or locally. And to that, I think you have to start though with the base building. I think you have to start with the programmatic responses to what people need. I think that's what opens people's eyes more than anything that you can say. It really starts with that aspect.
No, that's a good. Those are good breakdowns. My colleague Rasul, right, talks about how cities can lull us to sleep with these kind of things. Like they give you the sports team, the place of birth, and you start identifying with it. And next thing you know, you're kind of wrapped up into all the politics, and you start rooting for things that aren't necessarily, to your benefit. So
I like the next.
say what?
I like the next.
Yeah, yeah, or I'm a Philly fan, or whatever sports team or whatever. Like you could become very wrapped up in that, and it's like in
Yeah.
a way, sports is actually a good analogy because it's fandom is literally irrational. Like like, but if you just watching the game and then you're done, it's like whatever. Like you can kind of suspend reality, but then when that logic is applied to just like how you get housing in a neighborhood, or that logic is applied to the police, like then we have some problems, right? Like that's some of the organizing work. um I guess another question I had, this isn't, again, I'm asking a lot, so it's not written down, but y'all mostly answered most of my questions. But we talked about 2020 and you know, the abolition, defund the police. And I think it's easy sometimes, like we're saying with everything else, to kind of cling to stuff because it's under attack and not necessarily be critical of it because it's under attack. And I know Paca particularly has written some pushbacks on those on defund the police and abolition, and has pushed the idea of community control of the police. I'm curious how you, and this is a question for either one of you really, but how do you all see some of the, for lack of a better word, pitfalls of some of the tactics within 2020 and even prior to that? I'm using 2020 as kind of a
Mm,
reference point in terms of defund the police and abolition, the way that that got framed. Obviously, there was a real like violent pushback against it. We acknowledge that, but how do the pitfalls of it, like what pitfalls do you see, and how do some of those pitfalls maybe contribute to people embracing these more fascist approaches to so-called crime and things of that nature? Like, do you think there is any culpability there in terms of the way that folks approach that back in the day at this point? Like, do you think there's any
mm.
culpability there?
Yeah, that's interesting actually, the way you said that culpability. Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe on the question of, so for me, the question of abolition, it's very hard sometimes to pin down exactly what that means, and depending on who's and who's saying it. So I'll just go with what I think it
Hmm.
should mean or can only mean, which is, I mean, getting rid of certain institutions in part or entirely, right? Which to me would have to come as part of some kind of people's process, right? Some type of process in which people decide either a certain institution in a certain way or a part of it is not necessary. Which, again, let's take that as it is. I think when we think about community control, right, we've always looked at, I think, defund and abolition and said, you can't abolish anything you don't control, right? What is abolition without power? What is abolition without control? What is abolition even? How is it even a question to ponder, right, without a community organized to make democratic decisions about how their community is going to operate? So I think to your point, I think the miscalculation is thinking that we can appeal to power without attempting to take it, right?
Hmm.
Appeal to just the elimination of something, appeal to a reduction in a budget, but not call it the contradiction of why do they get to dictate terms in the first place, right? To me, when we're talking about community control, right, that's more of a question of we ought to dictate terms, right? The community ought to decide what does policing look like? What does safety look like, right? In this moment, right, for PACA, we've thought more about this idea of community control for public safety, just because with all the myriad of police forces and federal, it can get confusing, I think, substantively. But really, the fundamental point is when it comes to security, when it comes to safety, when it comes to protecting people, the community has to decide what that looks like, right? Organize ourselves to actually do that, right? And it has to operate as an alternative on institution. That's the only response to fascism, right? Like we can't respond to fascism by appealing to fascists to abolish themselves. Like, I mean, good luck. Like, I mean, but that's that, it almost becomes so in that way, I think there's culpability in that. I think an analysis that was not centered around power became prominent in that era. And I think that in some ways, people's response to Trump now, right, a very liberal response, a very hyper focused response, is kind of building on that same thinking. Is sort of it's more of an outcry. It's more of a we're going to shout at you about how much we don't like it, as opposed to planning for how we get rid of you, right? And I think those are very different things, and they can seemingly look the same, right? We talk about counterinsurgency, the sort of the radicalization of really liberal language. People can sound like they're talking about the same thing, but be advocating for something very different. So I think in this moment, right, talking about community control, it's a question of power. It's a question of organizing people. It's a question of organizing people to make decisions about outcomes. Whether that's policing, whether that's health, whether that's housing, right? It's a democratic question. So you can't get rid of the organizing part. And I think that, the appeals to defund and abolition um, in many ways, I think missed the mark in that they took that piece of it out of it, and these sort of became mass movements that were appeals to power instead of challenges to it.
Yeah. I do want to know, on Hood Communists is the great debate around that. There's a few articles, but also to the point, and one of the things that Paka notes is like the sort of private security forces that have erupted from that, right? So
Yeah.
even when we think that we've won some of these appeals, the state, because we don't have power, the state finds a way to repurpose or reuse or rename a lot of these institutions. So, and much of that is what happened. We did get a upsurge in private security, private policing. Yeah, especially in the narrative of the summer of carjackings and the summer of all the shoplifting and things like that of 2021 that followed the calls for defund. And then we see that all this propaganda around the youth.
Crime wave.
Oh, yeah, right. The crime wave that created the Safer America plan from Biden, that put more cops in across the nation, and emboldened and enlarged the 1033 budget that year. And so all of these things, when we talk about like these sort of federal policies and federal things, have been already happening as we've discussed low crime consistently. Because I think we're on like a 20 plus year trajectory of low crime. But somehow there's a way that they use specific instances of crime. Like even when they say low crime, they also are sure to say like 100 people died this year from violent crime. Like, but or they tally it or try to create a stat so that the crime is on your mind, that this is still this is still an issue that the state needs to resolve. So I think that's really to the point of like how defunding and abolition and community control has been discussed, has been around the question of like, how do we resolve some of these things that we do see occurring? Um, so I think Oliver spoke to that earlier. Like there are real things happening. And I do think in lieu of having any real answers or being pointed in any real direction or astroturfing, right? Because I think that's what happened with the fund of police. Is that we get that, and we continue to get that with like the Kings, no Kings rallies and things like that, where spectacle begets spectacle. So like for every Trump we get a no Kings rally because there's not a question about power.
And you're also reminding me too, right? I mean, it's in many places, but these post George Floyd, progressive change the police bills, they just get rolled back. After the moment wears off, they just change the policy completely and pass crime bills, right? So like without the power, it's like great. Like the political pressure, the desire to win elections, those bills get passed and they get rolled back immediately, right? Within a few years, at the federal level, they're rolled back. In cities, they get rolled back, right? So I think sometimes, right, but people they miss that. They miss the subtle. Actually, this thing that we thought we won, it's gone in 6 months, right? And I think that's part of it too, is that I mean, that's fundamentally right. The problem with reformism too is that right without the ability to protect that outcome, you're always at the mercy of these things just being taken away. Even whatever wins that you win, if you don't fundamentally change who's in power, all of those wins can be eroded very, very quickly.
Yeah, it's good. Thanks for that. Because, again, just more of even my own work, I've tried to just look back on some of these things to assess how the confusion of a time when we thought we were winning leads to the confusion in a time where people think they're losing. so, so being in a situation where, yeah, like you said, power wasn't necessarily challenged in the way that I think some folks thought they were challenging it. Obviously, there was new terminology that arrived in the mainstream, and in that sense, you were challenging terminology or the way we frame an issue, I guess. But it seems it seems increasingly like this is just another example of what's happening in DC, that a lot of these initiatives did not put people in a position to even, let alone take power, but even to defend themselves, So then we're forced to have to build out, like on the fly,
Yeah.
how to defend yourself from the so-called takeover or the troops coming in or whatever, because these things did not, figure they didn't build that kind of capacity up. So there was just a lot of conversations. And I think regardless of how you feel about abolition, like whether you agree with it or not, I'm not really necessarily interested in that debate. It's just, but it is. I do think you raise fair points in terms of how did it, what did it actually do to protect people? You know, like, and not just on a structural level, but even interpersonally. How did it? How was it? How successful was it in that sense? And I just think there's a lot of confusion that came out of 2020
Mhm.
that has, I think you can see our like everyday people who are not necessarily in some of these more activist spaces or nonprofit spaces are just kind of like, well, then yeah, just bring in the troops or whatever,
Yeah.
because
Right.
this shit didn't work. Like I'm saying, whether that's fair or not, that's what I've seen from people even that I know. Like that's just kind of the position. Like, wow, that shit didn't do anything. So yeah, just kind of let's.
Yeah.
And that's what fascism. If people actually want to go beyond just calling it fascism out of vibes, that's kind of the times that fascism appeals to people is when
Yeah.
these social democratic things failed,
Yeah.
right? And then fascism can kind of come in and take advantage of that vacuum, right?
Mhm.
I think the other thing 2020 did, and you wrote about it in your book, or like at least spoke to it, is that the way that they created like these silos of organizing, so that
Mm,
to speak about an escalation, we are ill prepared because people have not been, they found their own kind of niche and stayed there. Um,
mm,
so there has been, to Oliver's point, like a neglect in that base building process, because from 2020 to where we are now, for us to be underprepared for the moment or needing to scramble to meet the moment, I think speaks to the ways that we've missed the mark in the couple of years, especially the siloed organizing that I think help create this sort of hyper local fixation, right? Because people are now working on this, and I'm only working on this,
mm,
interested in how this connects to that because funding, but also like this
mm,
is where my interests are. And so we've seen a lot of that, to now there's a conversation. It's like, well, I know you're working on this and you're working on that, but how do we connect it? So even as we talk about these escalations, I don't even know that we are fully prepared to pivot from that siloed work. One of the things that I have been speaking about, at least in terms of PACA maybe I think 2 weeks before the announcement, just launched their healthcare initiative and their campaign for that, right? And then bam, here comes a federal takeover of DC. And so their ability to pivot but also still speak, not drop the work that they're doing, but the ability to pivot to meet the moment, I think we need more of, right? Because I don't think as of now, people are really willing to pivot to meet the moment.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point. I guess just for the audience sake, I can just spell out. So the program is the Pan African People's Wellness Front. It's a recently launched effort to build a community health program in Southeast DC, right? And the goal is for it to be community led, involve people in the training, bringing in medical volunteers, really modeled after the Black Panthers Free People Medical Clinic, which was one of obviously one of their most prominent programs. So that's the thought there. And PAC is kind of in the outreach phase of building that and trying to involve the community. But to add to your direct point, I think too it's the silo of issues, the single issue thing. I think that came out of 2020 is largely part of the problem too, and even I think our conceptualization of certain things as single issues, right? We Paka and I know others as well. We've talked about this a lot, right? It being Black August, thinking about political prisoners and liberating political prisoners, because that's also something, right? We're all doing, and we're focused on Black August, we're focused on that, but also there's this federal takeover. This is very direct in our face reaction to, right? In the midst of also doing, right, many of the Black August programming things that folks are already doing, right? That Paka's also been involved with. And it's something we were thinking about is in many ways, right, the legacies that we're commemorating are sometimes best commemorated by struggling, right, by actually struggling against what exists right now, as
yeah.
opposed to just pausing the struggle to commemorate sort of symbolically what was or what people sacrificed. It's like honor their sacrifice by winning now. Right, like the best way to honor folks' sacrifice, the best way to address Black August, again, to me, is to combat the very forces that incarcerated them to begin with, right? It's the same forces that are in our face right now. Like building a movement responsive to that, to me, is right a way that we do that. So I think to your point, Erica, it's definitely seeing the interconnectivity in things, and that health can't be separated from incarceration. Neither can policing, right? Neither can the question of political prisoners. So if we're building a campaign, right, our campaign has to include all those facets. And it's better that way. You bring in people who are interested in particular things. People will always have particular issues that appeal to them, but it's making them realize your issue is resolved by this broader focus on challenging the system as a whole.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's good points. Yeah, because I do think yeah, we just have to be better at assessing that because I think 2020 was. I mean, people that know me and think I have very negative opinions about that particular moment. But I don't. But yeah, because I just feel like there was I was talking to somebody and we were trying to do something on the arts tip. I was talking to somebody earlier and I was just like, we were trying to figure out how to move out of the not relying on any kind of academic funding or anything. And I was just like, people get so attached to that kind of like if you were funded, you build out your program a certain kind of way, and then now that funding is cut, and people think the problem is just that the funding was cut, so they don't know how to like. I was talking about a book talk I did at IU, and I told them I was like, this might get cut. Y'all might have to do this book talk off campus. You may not be able to pay for catering to have brunch while you do your book talk, but you could still go get some books and have a talk. Like it's not that complicated. But people have become very comfortable with having it both ways. And like you said, like both of y'all said, like these just siloed issues, and I don't know what people thought was going to happen. I mean, because even when we do political prisoner organizing here, it's like nobody thinks that's just the two people in prison that matter.
Right.
Like that's not how we approach the work. Like it's just these two people, and if they get out, then it's all good. Like it's just not a that's not even like you have to almost ignore what's happening to even come to a conclusion like that. Right. And so it's wild how all the rhetoric got thrown out, but that's people have been trained in that sense. So it puts us in a very difficult position, like you said, Erica, to pivot or to do something else because, folks are like, my funding is being taken away now, or there my this program that I set up these last few years, I can't serve these little black kids that I used to take care of, or what. Like it's just so you just see this pandemonium amongst kind of rad libs in general, and it's almost like that's the point is to just keep complaining about
Yeah.
what's being taken away.
I mean, that's
Mhm.
also how mutual aid came into the conversation in such an abrupt way during 2020 because of the ways that, people were being flushed with cash to be able to support some of these programs to do some of these things. And as we can see, that's being stripped away. Now there's a kind of overemphasis of the mutual aid versus, again, the question of power, right? Because then we're going to always find ourselves in this sort of subservient kind of position if we are not fighting for self-determination and sovereignty, at least in these cities that we claim. Like, how are we protecting ourselves? How are we feeding ourselves? I also think, though, it's interesting that 2020, your 2020 is my 2014, because I do think like that really has cataloged
No, I
like
agree. Yeah.
that really has set the way that the conversations are even had that put people in a position in 2020 to really take off and run with it.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, we are it culturally, organizing culturally has really took a hit from those
Mhm.
last 10 years, honestly, at least in terms of organizing well, at least in terms of online rather, because it's reflective in the way that people approach things and the inability to pivot. So it's not saying that the pivoting isn't happening because LA, right? But again, to Oliver's point, that's base building that started that. So I
Mm.
also think it's this kind of microwavable approach to organizing too. Like I went outside. What you mean we not free? Like like that kind of thing. And like, oh well, we ain't free yet. I'm going back inside. Like that kind of approach because it's work. And I think that we've kind of been used to organizing in a very particular way that did not require so much work out of us.
Mm.
And now the moment does.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, no, and what you said about the funding was interesting because I think sometimes people don't realize that certain concessions made to them are strategic, and they
Yep.
kind of just look at them in a vacuum, like, oh, we got our money, okay, let's focus on that. And it's like, no, somebody thought they seem angry. Let's cut them a check.
Yeah.
That'll
Let's give them
solve
a
that.
grant.
Let's
Yeah.
let's give them a grant, right?
Yeah.
So and sometimes people get lost in that too, that they think that there wasn't a strategic play there.
That
Um,
they were bribed effectively. I mean, that's
right.
what happened with yeah.
Right. But no, Erica just made me think about 2014, and I guess too, kind of thinking about all of this as an era. I'm speaking past my age. I'm like acting like I wasn't 16 in 2014, not an organizer, but speaking about I guess the period maybe, like the it's interesting to me in that we're kind of in another moment of like counterinsurgency in the sense that you think about kind of like post 1960s Kerner Commission, right? The way Black Power was shifted into meaning Black business, the response to urban rebellions, right? The implosion of the nonprofit industrial complex after the destruction of the Black Panthers, and the way in which so much radical energy was captured in that period, right? We start to have the first prominent Black politicians, right? The Blackness
Mm-hmm.
leadership
Mm-hmm.
really blows up in a way that it didn't exist before. And in some ways, right, this period mirroring that, and that we're seeing language get taken, ideas get taken, mutual aid become corporatized, and liberation, start to become kind of the sloganeering that things were in the way that it was used then too, in the way that sloganeering has sort of taken off and started to become the way everything is branded, and kind of this moment being the enemy responding right to these rebellions with that as a strategy. And I think sometimes there's a fine line, I think, between the influence we have culturally in people adopting language, adopting ideas, right, adopting
yeah.
certain things. I'm making when Nefa sees this, he'll be like, "You stole my point," but I'm making a point Nefa made last night about the whole APAC Shakur thing, that joke that was made earlier this week. And just interesting, right? That if
Charlemagne. Yeah.
yeah, sure, yeah. Which, like, interesting that somebody at that level, right, is making that kind of a joke, right? Like, oh, you're calling out APEC. That's interesting. Such a corporate media personality, right? So it's
Who's
interesting that when
also
things,
being funded by Zionists, but
right, it's like it's like interesting joke, but it just kind of goes to show that, like, there's a fine line between, I think, our efforts having influence and things being captured, right? The elite capture. It's like we want to have influence, we want things to spread, but also as things spread, there is a response to that is capture. Oh, that's becoming popular. Oh, you're doing that. People are resonating with that. Let's capture it and repackage that. And it seems like we're kind of coming not out of, but still in an era of that kind of counterinsurgent repackaging of the efforts that we've made.
Yeah, I mean that's what make a similar case with laundering, but it
Yeah.
just packages itself and trains people for the next uprising, and and it waters it down. So even the demands of the people's rage becomes weaker over time
mm,
because you've trained people to ask for less.
Mhm.
You know.
wow, that's a good point because I'm even thinking about like even as we see the reactions to what's occurring in DC, there it's really not clear what the demands of the people are, right?
Yeah.
Or there aren't, because the way that the viral videos are shown to the point of like the sort of branding and content driven organizing that's occurring, like it's about the moment, it's about the abuse, but you don't hear there's no kind of speaking to power or speaking about any particular kind of demands, or unless it's like take back DC, right? But what does that mean? And from whom? Take it back and give it back to Bowser, like, right? So there's not a real clarity on those kind of demands, and I think, yeah, because people are activated to be outside, they're activated to organize, they're activated, to have go-go sessions in the street, but that is a different thing from sort of the being emboldened to strategically organize to take back DC as like as a people's process.
Yeah, it's also something me and Rasul wrote, like we're writing about DEI, but like when you were talking to Oliver about like in the late 60s and 70s, even the concessions were stronger then. So even if you say that those were bribes, those were at least stronger bribes. Like affirmative action was a much better bribe than DEI. It ends up becoming,
Hmm.
40, 50 years later, right? People were able to buy homes and stuff, and you create an entire, you have a black middle class. And again, you can critique all of that, but I'm just saying those are material improvements
Right.
nonetheless, versus a few grants that people got in the last 5 years. Or if you want to go back to 2014, you can make the same case, right?
Hmm.
So even the concessions become weaker. So when folks say things like white backlash, I'm like, well, what are we being like? White backlash historically is about some kind of progress that was made and then it being taken away. But like, particularly, what progress are we talking about here? Overall, like what are we, like even when affirmative action was ended, like it was all but dead anyway. I'm talking about in the Supreme Court, right? Like what are we talking about here, right? Like what were the material benefits the masses of black people were even able to get out of 2020? Police killed more people every year, pretty much. Like what are we even talking about? So a lot of the so-called backlash we're being lashed for a perception of progress that didn't even really occur.
Right.
you know
Right.
so
Yeah.
versus, yeah, like
Yeah.
you're being punished for things that a few folks benefited from that you didn't even benefit from you know
Hmm.
and the people being punished the most did not get those grants. Those are the people that are being arrested. I'm almost sure if you cross-checked it, they didn't get the community grant to do something. Those are not the people that are being raided right now by the troops in DC or whatever, right? Like that's not how this went. So that's why I just felt like we need to have some kind of referendum, because like I was talking about earlier, when this kind of amnesia, we just move on. And it's like, well, some of these things are not just because the fascism is just winning and the right is just on this forward march or something. Like, yeah, that's part of it. But some of this is like there is a real problem in strategies and tactics here that I think folks need to assess if you're serious about really fighting back in any real way. Otherwise, it's just more content driven things to just say, and you just keep making your videos about how bad Trump is until they raid your apartment or something, right? Like that's
Yeah.
that's where this is headed. If
Right.
there's not a serious like grappling with maybe some of this shit doesn't work. Maybe we need to try some new things, or try some things that once were tried, but we've abandoned them because we thought they were too this or too that.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think there's an aversion to go back and study what we've been a part of. Even going back to 2012, the start of Black Lives Matter, 2014, and like even to as I'm saying these dates, I'm like hearing Oliver say like how we create these sort of markers, right?
Hmm.
But they are markers in terms of like you see they are distinctly like you can really if we go back we can map like oh this is exactly where this shit started to go wrong, this
Mm.
is exactly where this started to go wrong, um because you are a part of it, and so like when you're in it it's different because you're moving and you're trying to move things forward. But I think there's a benefit to be able to step outside of something and look and say like that didn't work and we should never do that again, or this was good. How do we progress this? How do we broaden it? How do we get more people involved in this? um but I just think at this point it's just a reaction to,
Hmm.
so things keep happening rapidly whether it's happening or not, because much of these things are just headlines. Some of these things are not happening, but there's a reaction to it anyway. So you have people who do not live in this area that are, reacting to videos. And but speaking specifically about Trump and ignoring that the badge says MPD. All those badges say MPD. Okay, ain't not one National Guard person out there, right? And so when you consistently see these kind of viral videos and it's always the MPD, the question that becomes like, what is the discussion being had exactly? And how are we actually understanding it? Because at this point, it is a reaction to Trump, which we're coming up on election season, and the way that pendulum swings is like right back into a democratic process, as if these people have our best interests in mind, that they are some sort of saviors. Um, so yeah, there is a delusion that comes along with the way that people react to and approach and avoid not even interrogating the things that we've already done.
Yeah, no, I think too there's and what you said, I guess, about it's not my house today, it's somebody else's is rated. I'm just gonna it's the individualism of it all too, I think is just part of it. And whether it's the individualism of just sort of the who I'm personifying as the enemy is an individual, or it's just who you like, you're thinking about everything from an individualistic standpoint. And I think that also hurts people's ability to look back through history, and that, right, a lot of times history is, to folks just think of it as it's just shaped by great people, right? There were a lot of great people greater than I who did a lot of great things that got us to where we are. And a lot of people's thinking, I think, of our movement history is that often, and not thinking about, I think, the organizational impact and the effort and the necessity that was part of it, right? And I think that exists today too. There's an individualism, I think, to the thinking about these issues, and sort of um you know, even people try. I need to take care of myself. I need to stay safe in DC. I need to, and a lot of it is like, well, you can't, right? To get it back to safety, you can't stay safe by yourself, right? That's an impossibility, right? You're not safe on your own, right? As an individual, right? In the face of what's happening, you can't do anything about it alone, right? You have to do things with others. You have to organize with people. And I think that from like the historical and the current perspective, it's just a reframing of that I think has to happen. That the history is not made by a bunch of individuals reacting, and people sort of just, they made the change. And even right now, right, the fixation on individually, how do you stay safe, individually making sure it's not my house, right? We got to get out of that mindset too. And I think a lot of people, right, the reaction to the system is to self-isolate, is to individualize, and we really need to do the opposite. And I think that's part of it as well.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Last question, because I'll go off about 2020 and 2014 all day. But I guess with all those things being said, what actions do you all find to be the most pertinent in terms of organizing around? Like, what are the, I guess, primary ways of organizing that you think would be helpful for this moment, both in DC and, like, you've both made the connections of how these tactics are being tested to be put elsewhere, and this is, and I don't know if anyone actually said it, but this is also just the imperial boomerang and all of those things as well. So what do you think are the best actions we should be organizing around in relationship to troops being put on the ground and the police feeling more emboldened than ever, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I think we could take a page from LA. I think now is the moment for constructing these self-defense coalitions and thinking deeply about what that means, and what necessitates that. To Oliver's point, this is not an individual fight any more than this is one organization's fight. Um, so I do think there is a necessity in this moment for more collective discussions amongst organizations, but then beyond those discussions, to the point of having these different skill sets, what did the trainings look like? So I think there needs to be more conversations and driving towards that. I also think locally, the work that PACA is attempting to do and has been doing for a long time, I think one of the benefits for me as somebody who does not live in DC is that I'm aware of everything that's happening in DC because I follow PACA. I read their statements. So I know about these bills. I know about when the city council has hearings. I know about what passes and doesn't pass because this is an organization that is deeply grounded in analyzing these situations and making it that analysis accessible. So even to the point of the discussion of community control versus, defunding the police, there's a history of that work that exists that we can always trace back to and say, well, these are the preconditions before, right? And this was what's happening then. This is what's happening now. What do we do? So I do think there's a usefulness in, having organizations that have been doing this work consistently in DC be a part of these conversations and around the self-defense because there's particular perspectives that are necessary. Um, but yeah, I think much of that is already on the ground happening. But I do, acknowledge that there's radical liberal aspects of so much of it, because even to the point, like, we'll see it, even to the point of individualism, there's a way that people get individually highlighted in these moments, right? That does detract from, no, there are groups doing these things. We went out with Paca Baptiste, I think maybe the second, third night of the takeover. And people just started gathering and gathering as they're walking through the park. Of course, the police did as well. Shout out to the Washington Post that let them stand up there and watch us on a roof. But people were coming around to, hear some of the conversations, hear some of the points of views that's different than what we're hearing on mainstream in terms of this, being a Trump specific and situation. But I do think, yeah, in terms of the organizing, I think we are at the point of the necessity for self-defense coalitions and, amplifying that.
Yeah, no, definitely agree with what Erica laid out. I I think it's always tough to answer what to do because the answer is really we need to do everything. Like we need to do all of these things simultaneously, right? And that we have to fight on different terrains, right? I think that the kind of the war of ideas, combating the narratives that are out there, whether it's sort of the narrative that, the we need to fixate on Trump, that we need to protect Bowser and her administration, that things will go away if we just wait for the next election cycle, right? That's what's circulating the most prominently in media, right? And we know we're at a disadvantage in terms of scale as far as corporate media is concerned, but not in terms of substance, right? Not in terms of the precision of the analysis that we have, and also our ability to form relationships, as in knocking on people's doors and having conversations in their neighborhood with them, right? We don't have our own CNN, but we can be in your face on a Saturday afternoon and knock on your door and talk to you about getting involved and have conversations and build personal relationships that can become political ones, right? So I think that the sort of the war of ideas, pushing out our analysis is key. And then I also think to other things as far as like both programmatic responses, right? Whether that's self-defense, whether that's addressing particular issues that are going unaddressed, right? Because the health issues are still persisting in our communities despite, right, this federal takeover. The housing issues are. The youth are still being targeted. Youth are still isolated, alienated, in many ways. So I think pulling people into those programmatic responses helps us build, I think, the mass support we need to really contest some of what we're seeing. But you also do that with direct resistance, right? With direct action, right? Whether that's something, like we did in the park, which is sort of more visual and sort of a speak out and sort of getting ideas, as opposed to sort of escalating your direct action, mobilization, right? Using mobilization to bring more people into the idea of base building. I think all those strategies have to happen at the same time, right? Because you need people, and people are going to have appeal to different things. There's people you're going to catch with a mass mobilization. There's people who they care about medical services in the community, and you can bring them in and connect them to what's happening with the federal takeover, and you get people in through these different spheres of influences. So I think it's just got to be a strategy that hits all these things. I think biggest thing too, and I guess maybe just a point about organizing, I think demystifying it a little bit, which I'm stealing that terminology from somewhere, but I can't remember where. But demystifying it, I only mean that like sometimes it is as simple as we need you with a spreadsheet out there knocking on doors, talking to people, getting their phone number down. We need you talking to the kids in the park about coming to this thing every Saturday. We need you that every Saturday. We need you to make phone calls every Tuesday. We need you to go pick up the flyers and bring them here because we're trying to get people out to this event. That is organizing. It's not glamorous. It's not grant funded. It's not going to get you a promotion. You can't put it on a resume anywhere. That's what we need you to do though. And we need people tapped in doing that in an organized way, right? Not as a lone wolf, not as a one-off, repetitive, recurrent processes. And that's over time, right? That's how you build the support. So I think, for PACA, that's part of it is, getting down to the very, I think, granular and specific things that people need to be involved with.
Now for sure, that's another episode, like demystifying organizing, because yeah, people really do treat it like it's some Jedi Knight shit or something. But yeah, thanks you both for being on here. I know we had to put this together on the fly, but I think this is a great conversation. So thanks for being on here, and I'll get this up as soon as possible. But yeah, appreciate y'all for coming through.
Appreciate you for having me.
It'll be a problem.
Okay. Fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the